those chapters deal with, it contains a lot of the plot there. One of the things in chapter 5 is it talks in some detail about the matter of adultery.
Yeah.
It talks about, and Jane actually mentions it much later on in the novel, I think it's about chapter 27 anyhow. It talks about those who have lusted after a woman have already committed adultery in their heart. Well, Rochester, here we come. And yes, and if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off.
Yeah.
And cast it from thee. Well, what happens to Rochester?
Yeah, exactly. Well, hello, Lillian. How's it going?
Hello, Piper. It's a particularly good day here for me. Is it a particularly good day for you?
It is, because we have the long-awaited pleasure of welcoming a very special guest to our podcast today. Professor Jay, welcome to Airbuds. Hello, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Professor Jay is here because we have talked for a long time about lots of different things with Jane Eyre, obviously. But we talked about the different themes, and every time we talk about themes or get to particular characters in particular episodes, we always say, and then obviously there's a lot of theology here that we don't understand, so we're going to do a whole episode on that. And we promised you guys an expert, and wow, have we found a great one. So Professor Elisabeth Jay is a professor emeritus at Oxford Brookes University who studies specifically and is an expert in Victorian literature and religion. She has some cool publications coming out later this year or early next year that we'll talk about here at the end, just a little sneak peek for you guys. But we're going to be chatting about all sorts of things, Jane Eyre and theology today. So without further ado, Professor Jay, how do you know about Jane Eyre? What was your first experience of Jane Eyre? And do you have any favorite adaptions?
Well, I think I first read Jane Eyre when I borrowed a copy from an older girl's bookshelf. And despite the fact I led a fairly circumscribed childhood, the one thing my parents never did was inspect what I brought back from a library. So I think I was 8 or 9 when I first read Jane Eyre. And all I really remember from that reading, I discovered later, was the fire and probably the madwoman. Not a great retention, but it hooked me. As for adaptations, I'm afraid I'm pretty much a text person when it comes to novels, especially 19th century ones. But I do remember watching the first BBC television adaptation in 1963. It was, of course, in black and white. Rochester was properly dark and brooding, but he wasn't what you might call handsome by the standards of those times, or actually even by the standards of these times, probably. And Jane, very properly, was represented, although I have seen, when I was looking this up, a rather more glamorous picture of the actress. She was represented as small, very plainly dressed, with her hair scraped back. She was indeed plain Jane. And I think that's quite important because those adaptations that sort of bring on a busty, beautiful Jane Eyre just get it wrong. So that helps, yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's one that we haven't gotten to see because we have to travel to the film archives in London, which is quite a ways from Minnesota, where we are based.
And I asked my daughter too. She first read, I think, an abridged version when she was about 9. And I emailed her today and she said she too remembered the fire, but she also remembered Edward Fairfax Rochester. It's stuck in her memory. She must have been a rather more advanced child.
That's wonderful. Since you are more inclined for the text, and I assume must have read it at least more than once to work on your research, how many times do you think you've read Jane Eyre?
Oh, gosh. I have to be careful because I was once asked a similar question about Bleak House when I was teaching in America.
Mm-hmm.
And when I said, I don't know, a dozen times perhaps, the girl in question said, "Oh, God, Professor J, you need a hobby."
Reading is a wonderful hobby.
I don't think I reread it straight through each time,
Mm-hmm.
but certainly many times, yes.
It's a great book to reread, I think, given those first impressions of Piper and I both read the book for the first time for the podcast. So we were not that what sticks with children, but that is very much what we found in the community who's obsessed with Jane Eyre is often your impressions change pretty significantly when you go from age 9 to age 20 to age 30 and so on. So,
well, you always bring your own experience, don't you?
mm-hmm.
And the stage you are at in life rather influences what you take from a novel. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we are focusing today on how to kind of interpret the themes of theology, of how different characters handle faith, of just how kind of people discuss, God and the Christian religion and such within this text. So Lillian, do you want to sort of lead us off with kind of a way to kind of begin this conversation?
Yeah, I think I'm actually going to steal one of your questions, Piper, because I think it's such a great introduction to our topic today. But there's so many things. One of our big episodes that we did after a year of studying Jane Eyre and spending time with this story was why Jane Eyre. And I think that ties really well into one of the questions that we wanted to chat with you about, which is what makes Jane Eyre unique in its approach to theology. So obviously, there's a lot of books that are discussing God and religion and life and all of those things. But there's something about Jane Eyre that is unique in so many ways. And I'm very curious as to how those themes around theology are unique in Jane Eyre.
Okay. Religious fiction was an established genre by the 1840s. But when I say religious fiction, what I really mean are pious tales, which were either pious tales to educate the young, particularly, or they were polemical tales stressing one church doctrine or one party in the church over another. Because at that point in the Church of England, it was a church at war with itself. Anyhow, these pious tales were written by adults, sometimes as kind of almost as conversion tracts, and they were written either for young readers or for the illiterate or for earnest Christians, and they frequently feature the terrible things that would befall those who did not lead a Christian life, and the rewards for those that did. Well, as the preface to the second edition that Charlotte Bronte wrote, lots of conventional readers picking up Jane Eyre, expecting something in the same sort of genre, were very shocked because the novel revisits all those scenes favoured by the pious tales, such as the sort of catechism conducted by Brocklehurst with Jane Eyre, or deathbed scenes, but using a very different perspective. Because children in the pious tales are very much passive objects. They're seen on a deathbed and they make appropriate responses. But what Charlotte Bronte does, which is what's so unconventional, is to imagine seeing these scenes through a more realistic child's eyes view. So she sort of interrogates what it would feel like to be put through a catechism by Brocklehurst, or what would it feel like to witness and feel the death of a fellow pupil, Helen Burns. she's not just a silent onlooker being lectured at and saying, you should take this, this and this, and you better have some pretty good answers on your deathbed. She doesn't have that kind of answer. Or again, when she goes to see Mrs. Reed, the ghastly aunt, it isn't exactly a hellfire scene, but she's not. Mrs. Reed isn't repentant. There's no last-minute conversion, and Jane doesn't forgive her. That is pretty stirring stuff. So what you've got in this novel is the still small voice of conscience, positioned not in an obviously powerful person. She's the least important person in her circles. She's a penniless orphan. She's a governess, which is low status. And at one stage, she's a beggar. But yet, she is allowed to interrogate the Bible, verses from the Bible. And it's a novel that repeatedly asks, who holds religious authority? Does that help?
Yes. Oh, for sure it does.
And most of all, it's a rebellion against the prevailing preaching of, what is the ideal Christian woman? The ideal Christian woman is a silent, suffering model of domestic martyrdom. And Jane rejects that at every level.
I love how you mentioned when talking about, her status and kind of where she is in this world when it comes to the power that she has to interpret and kind of share that what her interpretation or read of this is. That's something that we've definitely discussed when reading the novel, is that, despite everything the world has handed to Jane, she still maintains this, this independence and this strength. And it's something she even includes in her sort of monologue that she gives to Rochester before, he proposes and everything, to say, I'm a person with a free, independent will, and I will do as I please and go throughout the world as I please. So I really like seeing that comparison made there. That's cool.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the other things that really stuck out to me is Piper and I often will say that one of the first things that was really jarring for me about Jane Eyre, and I think some of that is coming in as an adult, is how cruel these adults are to these children. And something that Piper and I will often say to justify it was, this was before children were people. And so I think that's a really interesting perspective to think about that, and particularly in regards to the text in religious texts, and how there were those pious stories and children weren't people in those either. And so it really is sort of humanizing both children in both Jane and Helen.
I think that's actually it's important, and it's important in all the Bronte novels, that children, one of the things they'd taken from their Puritan evangelical upbringing was the notion of original sin. All their children are really pretty awful at various stages. Jane doesn't hesitate to fight her cousin John. She's not a pious little girl in a velvet dress.
Yeah.
So I have to imagine that you have also done some research surrounding Charlotte Bronte's life. Is that accurate? Yeah?
Yes.
Could you, I feel like this seems kind of like an obvious thing that you talked about her growing up with this kind of Puritan upbringing, but then the fact that her father was a clergyman. Can you talk about that and maybe how that influences her writing and the story?
I think it's very interesting. Her father is in one way a sort of slightly curious character, in the sense that he's a sort of self-made Irishman who gets an education and so on. He actually, unlike many evangelicals who believe that fiction was only slightly better than drama and both were evil, the devil made things, he actually wrote fiction himself. And he saw himself, when he talked to Elisabeth Gaskell, he talks about himself as a character from one of her novels. Parson Hale from North and South, and he says, many people regard me as rather eccentric. There was that, and there was the Methodist aunt. But clearly, those children were allowed considerable freedom to pursue their own interests. They're writing from a very young age. Mm-hmm. So growing up in a clergyman's household, and I can speak to this myself because that's what I did, you encounter a number of clergymen, not all of whom you like. And, clearly those children, another thing I think one needs to think about is they're brought up. They don't have a mother's socialising presence there. And they're brought up in a fairly remote place, however, in Yorkshire. And so when they are sent off to school, they suddenly encounter religion and evangelicalism, not as it were, something their father talks about or something they hear in their local church. They encounter it institutionally. Mm-hmm. And that is so whether they're at school or when they go out to earn a living. They find it in institutions, whether they're richer families and so on, governed and run by others according to their mores. And all the sisters' novels are concerned at some very basic level with how to maintain a self-respecting spiritual independence while needing to earn a living and at least appear to occupy the women's roles expected of them by a larger upper middle class society.
I think that leads really well into another question, sort of their structural upbringing versus their home upbringing and how they experience that going into the world. That is absolutely a theme I see so strongly in the text of Jane Eyre. And one of the questions that I really wanted to chat with you about is Charlotte Bronte seems to be making a point about how she thinks people should be approaching religion and the church. And I'm curious as to if you think there is like a point in this, if there are answers to these questions that she's posing. And if so, what is she trying to tell readers about sort of your spiritual life and the church?
Big question. Spiritual life is very important. And it's more important to have integrity in that than to seek happiness. Do you remember one of the points she makes? It's a very Protestant view of life when she tells Rochester, we were born to strive and to endure, not to seek after happiness. Mm-hmm. But of course, spiritual independence is one at a cost. The problem is, I think she doesn't entirely escape the problem she wants to explore. Brocklehurst is easy in a sense. He's the big bad wolf. He's actually described as having, large teeth, large nose, as if we were in Red Riding Hood. And he's an easy target. He's a almost cartoonish caricature of a hypocrite. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And against that, of course, you have St. John Rivers. And the problem you're encountering there is a rather different one. I mean, he is what you might say he's almost a fanatic. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He's solitary. It's his absolutism will reduce Jane into docility and passivity, into being a handmaiden, always bowing down to his authority. And yet, what is one to make of the fact that, I suppose we're approaching the end rather too fast of the novel, but I don't know whether you want to go and talk about the ending of the book in St. John River.
We can pop around, I think. I feel like since we're talking about these big themes, It works to go back and forth.
Absolutely. Well, in one one sense, the ending of the novel allows St. John Rivers, it allows him a place among the survivors. He's, in some senses, a good man who is striving to.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about the very few people who do survive at the end of the novel, Jane manages to kill a good number of people, doesn't she?
Yes.
Or see them off after their usefulness in defining her development is over. But it's problematic because the author has, throughout, criticised him as someone who has seen the vocation of a missionary more as fulfilling his desire to be a hero.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
A missionary I resolved to be. Well, actually, if you're a clergyman, it should be. And he's not content with just being a humdrum clergyman in a parish. You know, he wants to be heroic, a soldier, a martyr. And some critics have seen the end of the novel as validating St. John's position. I'm not quite sure that that is the case. I think, like so many Victorian novels, this novel has two endings. There is Jane tucked up in bliss with Rochester. It's as if we've got Paradise Lost. There they are, arm in arm, hand in hand, wandering off into the world, this world.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got St. John Rivers, who seems to think he's part of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, heading for the great city. He's solitary, unmarried, uncomplicated by doubt. The problem is neither of those endings is terribly satisfactory. Yes, Jane has got her Rochester, but they're not actually involved in any kind of society. They get a visit every other year from her cousins. It's not a great social life. And it's quite clear that Rochester is going to be ostracised by society, who discover that, you know, wife number one has died in a great fire, how conveniently, and then he marries the governess. I mean, you know, definitely not. That's all rather ignored by Charlotte Bronte. So that's not a solution. Nor, I think, really is St. John Rivers. I mean, yes, he quotes from Revelations at the end, but he doesn't actually mention the last verse, which is about a kind of God's peace to all. It's still him, and he is going to be received.
It's so interesting. I feel like, because when we discussed this chapter of the book, you know, I feel like for everything else, we were able to draw conclusions about things. And this one, it's just so hard to say, like, you know, what is the point? Why does she end this way? Why does St. John get to tag along as part of this ending that you talked about? Again, I don't have a good answer for it, but I wanted to kind of like talk too about this interesting idea that I didn't realize until I was hearing you speak on this, when kind of examining both Brocklehurst and St. John, is that they are kind of the bookends of this story. We open with Brocklehurst's like not so great introduction to how he sees faith. We end with St. John's not so great how he sees faith. And then there's Jane's story in the middle. And I hadn't really thought about that before, but it's very interesting.
Well, the book is in one sense a great defence of evangelical Protestantism. And perhaps, would it help if I said a little bit about what's going on in the 1840s?
Please, yes, thank you.
Well, although this novel is theoretically set, so it's a bit vague, isn't it, sometime towards the end of the 18th century and in the early pre-Victorian years, Charlotte Bronte is writing in mid-century, and her readers are reading in mid-century. And, okay, so what's going on at that point? I think there are two things, really. There is what I've already referred to, the church at war. That's very important. It's the stuff of daily news. I mean, if you think about Trump and Biden, what the leaders of the church are saying makes the major newspapers of the day, because you have the Oxford movement, which is a group of clergy who want to reassert a more Catholic understanding of the Church of England. They want to assert the importance of the Church as a teacher and of clergy as mediating the Bible. It's learning, and they're the interpreters. Now, that's against a very Protestant understanding of every man his own interpreter. All that matters is faith. And where do you get that? You get it by reading the Bible. So is the Bible, on the one hand, a very simple, open text that anybody can read and understand? Or is it actually a very complex text that needs to be unpacked by clerical teachers? Now, this setting obviously predates the conflict, but it very much raises these issues. Are all clergy, regardless of their human foibles, better positioned to interpret? Well, clearly not. Brocklehurst is a rotten interpreter, and Miss Temple is a terrific one. And that, I think, is one of the issues. The other issue that I think is hugely important, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, is about the position of the Bible in that society. We'll come on to that when you want to.
No, I think you really hit the nail on the head there with the people that I like their interpretation and understanding of religion in Jane Eyre, which I think is very intentional on Charlotte Bronte's part, is Helen and Miss Temple, and some of what Diana and Mary say towards the end, like their understandings, and even some of Rochester's understandings, are more kind of human, and they do have that like personal level of interpretation. And where people who are painted as villains, in at least Brocklehurst is. I personally have made my feelings about St. John quite clear. I don't think Charlotte Bronte felt as strongly about St. John as I do.
I think she does. I mean, there's that whole business about how he uses the Bible. Do you remember when he, at family prayers, he reads Revelations, and at that moment she almost goes under.
Yeah.
That's Piper's least favorite scene in the book.
Almost called away. She's almost sucked into his view. But his view is, it's so absolute. If you don't become my handmaid and give up German, study Hindustani, become my helpmeet, then you're lost.
I'm getting angry now listening to that.
Well, it is interesting because he so clearly uses the Bible as a tool, to try and influence her and the others around him. And that's not something that we see as much with Helen and Miss Temple. And I feel like there's even a discussion to be had about different like gender roles as well, of, how we communicate and how we try to like influence people around us. But it is definitely more of that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think one of the very interesting things are the discussions that Helen and Jane have as children, where Jane is actually allowed to express this sort of very strange thing. Well, perhaps there isn't a heaven. How can you be so sure? And Helen is what was called a universalist. She says she's made it up for herself, and it's not something she's encountered in any teaching, which just means that everybody eventually will be allowed a shot at heaven, as it were. And that is, again, very interesting. I mean, Patrick Bronte, their father, is on record as really disliking people who attempt to convert simply by preaching hellfire.
Good.
What awaits you if. And, of course, Carus Wilson, who is often thought of as the model behind Brocklehurst, edits this terrible paper, The Children's Friend, in which you have a series of these awful deathbeds, warning you, that you have very limited time, and it's up to parents as soon as the child is born to break their spirit and to bring them to Jesus, as it were. And both those are rejected for a simpler ministry. But of course, Jane or Charlotte, depending on how close you think the two are, because I think that is something that some readers tend to ignore. There is, Charlotte Bronte is an older author who does see that some of Jane's behaviour as a child would try anybody. And that some of her reactions are exaggerated. I mean, horrible and beastly though her cousin John is, he's not Caligula, which she sees him as. I mean, there is an exaggeration there.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that you and I chatted a little bit about before our conversation today, I'm sorry, guys, I talk to people that's not recorded sometimes. We love you, our listeners, but every once in a while I have conversations that isn't in front of a microphone. But you had referenced that there are specific textual references, like when Jane is a child, that are kind of mirrored if you go and look at the text in the Bible in what plays out in Jane Eyre. And I find that so interesting because that is something that completely went over my head.
Can I talk about that a bit?
Yes, please do.
Okay. I think the first thing to say is, as a society, we have completely lost, even churchgoers for the most part, have lost the sense of the centrality of the Bible. It was a reading primer. I mean, just imagine that was your earliest reading primer. It's very difficult to read. But that's what, children were given, and it's what working men were given to help them to learn to read. It was a primer, but it was also a lexicon. It produces your language for you. So it's a master text always. You were talking about bookends before, and actually the Bible, Jane Eyre starts with the Battle of the Books. Of course, one of the books that she's always wrestling with is the Bible, because the Bible, especially in evangelical homes, was known intimately because at family prayers, which took place every day, usually the father, and especially if you were in a clerical family, would read a portion of the scripture every day. And in some families, you quite simply read your whole way through the Bible, beginning at the beginning, all the way through to the book of Revelation, and then you started again. So you would really have known it. And then you went to church services where people did this, and at school they did it. So it supplies imagery, of course, but Charlotte Bronte's interrogation of the Bible in this novel, I think, is far more detailed than that. Remember when Jane mentions the books of the Bible that she likes and dislikes, and she's very specific. She doesn't like Psalms because they're boring. She likes the book of Revelation, she likes the book of Daniel, and she likes some of the Old Testament. Basically, she is selecting a Bible which accords with her desire to see herself as an oppressed victim. When John writes, when John writes or allegedly writes Revelation, it's written during a period of persecution of the Christian church. The book of Daniel is about standing up to tyrants. Kings and Chronicles that she talks about, is quite clear that what she really likes is the books of vengeance. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. If you look back at her preface to the second edition, I bet virtually nobody who reads it bothers to go back and look up who Ahab and Micaiah were. Well, when you do, you'll see that there was a lot of prophesying death, and if you don't listen to the prophet, see what happens to you. But more than that, the Bible produces a kind of structure to the book. Do you remember when she's at Lowood? One of the things she talks about is that they have to commit to memory 3 chapters.
Yep.
And the chapters are very specific. The Gospel of Matthew, chapters 5 to chapter 7. Well, it's very worthwhile having a look at those chapters because those chapters deal with, it contains a lot of the plot there. One of the things in chapter 5 is it talks in some detail about the matter of adultery.
Yeah.
It talks about, and Jane actually mentions it much later on in the novel, I think it's about chapter 27, anyhow. It talks about those who have lusted after a woman have already committed adultery in their heart. Well, Rochester, here we come. And yes, and if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off.
Yeah.
And cast it from thee. Well, what happens to Rochester?
Yeah,
He's
exactly.
That's not an accident that he's blinded and maimed.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next chapters go on to include the Sermon on the Mount. And this is not about interpreting the Bible taking the spirit of the text, not the letter of the law. And Matthew chapter 6 spends a lot of time talking about practicing charity quietly, not showily. So the whole Brocklehurst thing about a regimen of a charitable institution, that's reading the letter of the law, and then you get Miss Temple, or you get moving on to the Rivers family and the way that they practice charity and God's capacity to provide good things for his children. Nevertheless, Charlotte Bronte also interrogates all that, and she says, well, it's all very well saying, take no thought for the morrow, the lilies of the valley, etc., know how to dress themselves. Actually, when it comes down to it, we do need bread. She gets to a stage where she's fainting from lack of food. And she becomes like the prodigal son. She's even prepared to consider eating the pig's twill, straight from the Bible again. So again and again, you can see sort of foretelling. Or Bertha is very much seen as the scarlet woman who falls from a great height in the book of Revelation, just as she falls from the battlements eventually.
Fascinating. If you had to suppose, how much of this do you think is intentional of her kind of making these parallels versus it's simply slipping in because she lives in a society where you read these stories again and again and again, and you can't help but, kind of take from that subconsciously?
I think the structural stuff is very deep in a lot of Victorian novels. If the sort of meta-narrative you're used to is working from original sin to the vision of the new heaven and the new earth, that is bound in some sense at a deep level. But a lot of this is very much planted. I mean, it's not an accident, is it, that she mentions particular chapters from Matthew? Right. She could just have said, we were always required to learn a chapter from the Bible, but she doesn't. And, if a child falls asleep at Lowood, they're treated really badly. When a young listener to Paul in the Acts of the Apostles falls asleep and falls off the window ledge, they're very worried about him. They look after him. All these things are... So incidents like that and the maiming of Rochester, I think, have to be seen as references that her readers will pick up on.
Cool. That was another...
Now, of course, not all her readers. I mean, that is another problem, isn't it? Because, the fashionable lady who just liked reading a 3-volume novel and doesn't really listen in church might not have done. But the kind of people that Charlotte Bronte herself, is a very quiet, in some ways pious woman, is writing for will pick them up, I think.
I think that actually transitions, perfectly into, because like Lillian and I saying, we didn't pick up on these things because I haven't closely read the Bible since I was in Sunday school. And so there's a lot of the stuff that just simply goes over my head. And so it's so interesting to think about, too, the way that this story would have been written or would have been read and consumed at a time when people were maybe more closely familiar with those stories and with those exact references, to maybe today and now in an audience where, unless like yourself, Professor Jay, who studies this and knows what to look for, maybe some of these modern audiences are picking up this book and they don't see those things. So maybe we can talk about, how the story kind of evolves as it's read through time.
I think that's certainly true. I mean, even by the end of the century, Jane Eyre is still being seen as a revolutionary novel. The question is why, of course. I mean, and that, of course, is also true. The waves of criticism that have come in the latter end of the last century, and now, at one stage, Jane Eyre is being seen as a novel that both uses and challenges the Gothic convention. Then it's being seen as its interest lies in the intersection between biography and autobiography. How much is it Charlotte Bronte emoting, and how controlled a novel is it? Is it controlled at all? Or is she just pouring out her desires for a satisfying romantic relationship? And then you get on to the post-colonial critique and so on. The one thing I think has been very disappointing for the most part is even quite good editions are inclined to say things like annotating Jane's, which bits of the Bible she likes. And it just says simply, these are some books from the Old Testament and the New Testament. Well, that's no help at all. You actually need to know what those books were about and why she likes those. So I do think that it has been, people sort of missed that was the great intertext, the Bible in it. And many of those other perspectives on Jane Eyre are also very useful. But I think that if you don't see the Bible as standing very firmly behind the whole of it, you're missing quite a lot.
Yeah. Is there an annotated version that you recommend that does point those things out well?
I hate to say this, but I have actually, in this 5-volume edition that's coming, and you can cut this bit if you like, but I have included a big section on how one would go about excavating a novel like Jane Eyre. I've done it with a Hardy novel as well, and seeing why those things are important and why they help us to understand Victorian fiction.
Wonderful.
Which we for sure are keeping this in, because that's very cool to know. But the books that she's referring to there's a 5-volume set that's coming out either at the end of this year or early next year. And we're recording this in 2023 in case anyone's curious and listening way later. And it's called The Bible and Western Christian Literature. So keep your eyes out, edited by Professor Elisabeth Jay, who we have here right now.
So, but take it away for some of our...
No, there's so many things kind of within that. I think one of the big questions that I have in reading this, and I've sort of alluded to this in other questions, but I think it ties really well into what you're talking about with that idea of historical versus now. We talk a lot on this show, especially since we are watching different adaptations of the book. So you're obviously seeing how did they look at this in the 1940s, and how are they softening it in 2006 versus 43? And is that the point? Like, you're softening it with the view of society in that moment? And so I'm really curious, particularly when we're looking at these religious and theological conversations, what are the points and references in Jane Eyre that are like the points that are being made, and some of those criticisms of the church and the way we should be approaching things that disconnect from society that we see, that you referenced with Jane and Rochester, and how that looked then and how that still is a relevant conversation now?
Okay, I can give you one very obvious point in the novel, which I think is a problem that Charlotte Bronte doesn't entirely know how to cope with herself. And modern society certainly doesn't. You remember, well, how could one forget, the way in which Jane returns to Rochester, and then Rochester says, "I was calling for you." Right, so how is that? I mean, give me an account of a very recent adaptation. How is that done? Is it done as a telepathic moment or what?
So it depends. I feel like typically what we've seen most is that it is kind of treated as this sort of magical realism moment. And I have often seen it, I think, is, she and St. John are out on the moors and they're having this kind of, debate. I think in the 2011, the most recent one, that's when this happens, is when he's, saying, "Come away with me." And she says, "I'll do it as your partner, but not as your wife." And he has "You're made for labor, not for love." And it's kind of
a classic romantic line.
Great pickup line there, St. John. But then it's in that moment that, I think she's walking away from him and St. John is shouting after her, "Jane," but then another voice comes in her head and we hear it's Rochester shouting after her instead. And that's the one that she follows and goes to. So it's, I think, usually kind of a magical realism sort of portrayal.
See, I think it's what complicates it in the novel is Jane herself never tells Rochester that happened. And there's something about, well, he's a bit of a depressive. And you think, well, why would that make him depressed? Actually, it would cheer him up considerably to know that his voice has reached her. But Charlotte Bronte kind of covers this up as, well, I pondered those things and kept them in my heart, which, of course, is, again, a line from the Bible about Mary. And you think, well, that's foreclosed a rather big discussion about what was going on there. And she does that from time to time, and it's very irritating. She does it, and I wonder whether her problem there is she would have been brought up possibly by the aunt, who was the Methodist, on quite a lot of Methodist tales which engage in what's called special providence. God particularly looks after those who obey him, so that, if you're a godly person and your coach driver isn't, the coach driver is killed in the crash, but you're not.
Wow.
And I wonder whether the romantic in her is very pleased by this notion, but then she thinks, actually, it's a bit like special providence, and it's a bit like what was called enthusiasm, which meant really fanatical religious devotion. How can I know that this is the word, this is God doing this, not my desire? And as I say, she doesn't allow the reader to ponder on this, and Jane kind of just shuts us out at that point. There's another point at which this happens, way back in the novel. She'd had this discussion with the dying Helen, and basically Helen has this sort of view that it's better that she doesn't live any longer because she might have committed more sin, and anyhow she's going to heaven. And Jane says, well, where is heaven and how do you know? Then the novel closes down completely. For how many years is it? 8 years?
Yeah.
Right. And it starts with, well, I erected a tombstone, and on it is Resurgam, which, as we know, means I will rise again. Well, at what point did Jane decide she agreed with Helen that there is a eternal life, etc.? It's all very well just kind of to put in a biblical text and say, right, no further discussion, when the rest of the novel is telling us we should be discussing and we should be interrogating responsible women, and it isn't just for the clergy.
I think that connects so well with something Piper and I talk about a lot, which is the idea that as much as there are answers in this text, there are questions. Like, she's not as much telling us, here's what you should think and believe, as much as she's going, here's what we should be thinking about.
Right.
It's a troubled and a troubling novel. Yes.
Absolutely. As we kind of start to wrap up our conversation here, one thing I would love your advice and suggestions on are, so if we're going to go back and reread this novel again, what should we be looking for? What are some things that we should maybe do some research on beforehand to get a new perspective?
Well, I think if you do come across copies of the novel with notes, and it just says, see Matthew 3, it's worth looking at Matthew 3. I mean, it's as simple as that in a way, because I think, I could sort of send you to lots and lots of books about 19th century theology. And in a way, it's sort of helpful and it informs what I've said here a bit. But I don't think that's, in one sense, what she's getting at. She's getting at, and it's something that, women, quite simply, did not study theology. Theology was studied at university, and women didn't go to university in her time. So how did you get at it? And if the Bible's that simple, and reading the Bible can convert you, well, there are lots of snags with that, aren't there? Because everybody in that novel reads the Bible differently. So that's constantly being raised as a question. And so how did women express their views? Well, they took to fiction and poetry and what's called devotional literature. Because none of those things, theoretically, needed any formal training. There were no rules for the novel. You could shove in whatever you wanted. You could put in, and lots of male authors did, a couple of chapters on fox hunting and to pad out your novel. Whereas if you were writing a drama or an epic, you actually needed to know some formal rules. So fiction was one way of women exploring their spirituality. Poetry even more so.
I love that. That's great.
Okay.
Is there anything around this topic that we haven't addressed yet that you think we can't end this interview until we talk about this?
Only one other thing, I suppose, occurs to me. There's quite a lot in this novel about the afterlife, isn't there? And St. John is pretty certain what he thinks the afterlife's about. Jane isn't even certain there is one. And Helen thinks it'll be nice because it'll be quite restful.
Which, fair.
Yes. Actually, that's another place where doubters and also women in particular could explore their reactions to religion, because the Bible doesn't actually say very much about the afterlife. We're just told there's a mansion and there'll be many rooms. Make of it what you will, as it were.
No, I think that's all of your points are so great. And frankly, we could keep you here for another 3 hours because more questions keep occurring to me. But that feels rude. So first,
as long as you've got enough material from it, that's fine.
Oh, it's been wonderful.
Great. This is perfect. Our listeners are going to love this. And thank you so very, very much. I'm sure we'll thank you again, but just thank you so much for coming on and taking the time to do this. It genuinely has been a joy. It is an area where I don't think I ever sat down and read the Bible. I think I did like sometimes, but I haven't in many, many decades. So I just think it's so lovely to get this additional context because, to your point at several points during this conversation, it is so integral to the structure, and you see that when you're reading it, even if you don't pick up on all of it. So it's really helpful to have this additional context, and I appreciate you coming on.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. Enjoyed it.
Professor Jay, it has been absolutely wonderful speaking with you about this, to kind of not only get the insight that you know that we were lacking before, but also to just like talk back and forth about, what do we think about this? What do we think about that? Every time you said, remember when Jane did this? My heart swelled. I was like, I do. Yay, I love this. There's nothing more fun, at least for me, that I've gotten out of this book and its adaptations, is getting to connect with the community and fellow people who are so inspired and intrigued by this story. So if you want to talk to us more about how you feel about this book, you can find us on all the social. It's at Airbuds. Send us an email. We want your lengthy theology dissertation that you wrote about Airbuds, about our podcast, obviously, but about
obviously a lengthy philosophical theology dissertation about Airbuds. I would read that so hard.
Oh my gosh. But specifically about Jane Eyre, we are airbuds@gmail.com.
If you loved this so much that you're like, I need to give these ladies $3, I have great news. I have fantastic news. We have a Patreon. You can go on there. Piper just recently, so it's been on there for a while by the time you guys are listening to this, but just this week, I got to listen to The Master of Thornfield, an hour-long NPR style musical experience where Piper made a playlist that she explains song by song about Edward Fairfax Rochester and his story in life and how he went through the world with songs from all different genres. It is truly incredible. And you can listen to that for the low price of $3, guys. It's a steal. On our Patreon.
And also, if you don't have $3 to spare, don't worry. I get it. Tight. Money is tight. You can also just leave us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice, because that helps get it out to more people, and it makes our days a little brighter.
It does. And you can put in what your favorite theological reference is. Please just list a Bible verse with no context, because I enjoy confusing people who read our reviews.
But yes, so that's all we have for you today. We'll see you a week and a half from now, depending on when you're listening to this.
It'll be 2 weeks from now. And I have in my notes, we're back to an adaptation of Jane Eyre. We're watching a 1971 Spanish miniseries.
Hooray! This one has been a big chunk of viewing time.
She's large.
And we have to pay attention because it's only in Spanish. So join us for that.
It's so difficult, but we love you, and that's why we're doing it.
So we can't wait to see you guys that time.
Thank you again, Professor Jay, for coming on. It genuinely has been such a joy to have you here today.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Goodbye.
We'll see you guys next time. Happy Jane Eyre reading and watching. Bye.
Bye.